fantasy football. I hope you guys are having a great Tuesday. It's crazy that week 1 of the NFL season starts this Thursday. I'm so excited. I hope you guys are excited. So today we're going to be talking about week 1 of the NFL fantasy season, talking about storylines, players that you can look to trade for, as well as running back and wide receiver stashes that I think are going to be really valuable in the future. But before I get started, I just want to say thank you so much for supporting and watching this channel. It's been a little bit over a month since I've started it, and it's just been a lot of fun. I love hearing from you guys of what you guys would like me to cover. And so feel free to message me or write down in the comments what you guys would like me to cover. If there's a topic that I haven't gone over yet, or if you guys have any questions about players to trade for or players to play over a different player, let me know. I love getting you guys involved, and that's what it's all about for me. So with all that said, we're going to get started going over week 1. Now, generally, when I go through these weekly videos, I'm going to be covering who you guys should start over someone else, players that you guys should try to target to trade for, as well as players that could be good running back handcuffs that you could stash on your bench right now and hope that they're going to do well in the future. So for week 1, obviously we haven't seen anyone play yet, so it's a little hard to say, hey, this guy's not going to perform well, you should play this other guy. But I think there are some streamers that you could play if you're hurting at the tight end or maybe quarterback position. But if you guys drafted a player, you're probably going to play him. You're probably not going to bench him. But for those of you who are really weak at running back and drafted a bunch of wide receivers, you may be hurting right now. You may be trying to find someone to fill in, especially those who drafted J.K. Dobbins. But that's what we're going to cover first is injury news, going over storylines. J.K. Dobbins is actually a storyline that I'm a little concerned about. They haven't said that he's not going to play yet. But whenever they're kind of like hesitant on telling you if he's going to play week 1 and it's almost like Sunday, it's a little concerning. And so guys, I would keep an eye on, we're going to talk about it a little bit, but keep an eye on Mike Davis and Kenyon Drake. I know that the Baltimore running room is kind of difficult when the starter is out. We saw last year they drafted a bunch of people. Sorry, not drafted. They traded and picked up for in the middle of the season. They got Devonta Freeman like last minute last year, who ended up doing pretty well. But if you guys were faced with that decision last year of should I play this random running back on the Ravens, it definitely got a little messy. But if you guys have J.K. Dobbins and you don't have any other running backs, you may have no other choice. And so keep an eye on Dobbins. We don't know if he's going to play week 1. Yeah, he's a guy that you're probably going to have to find insurance for. Next up, we're talking about Zach Ertz. He's another guy that is day-to-day with a calf injury. The Cardinals haven't fully committed to him if he's going to play week 1. And even if he does play, people are expecting him to be limited. So what does this mean? I think you guys should look at Trey McBride. He's a rookie tight end on the Cardinals that they drafted this year. They really like him. And unfortunately with the Cardinals, like he's probably going to have to play. If Ertz is out, he's going to have to make plays and get receptions, just because they are hurting at receiver. Hopkins is suspended. And so basically that leaves them with Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore, and AJ Green. Now, those options aren't terrible, but Kyler definitely likes the tight ends, and I think they're going to be looking for McBride. So just keep an eye on that Ertz storyline, especially if he's your top tight end and maybe you took him in the 7th round, you're probably a little frustrated, which I totally understand. Another guy is Jalen Waddle. He has been injured recently, but he's back practicing. They say that he's going to be ready for week 1. So that's really encouraging because you probably drafted him pretty early. You probably got him in the 4th or 5th round. And so you're going to want him to play. But it looks like he's going to play. So I would start him with confidence and count on him to do well. If for whatever reason he does get hurt this year, or say Tyreek is out, a guy that you should keep an eye on for the Dolphins is Cedric Wilson. He was on the Cowboys last year, and he actually did really well filling in for Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb and kind of being that third option. I don't have a ton of confidence in him. If Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are healthy, I don't think he's necessarily going to get a lot of points with those two on the field. But if one of them goes out, I would actually feel pretty confident streaming him. He's a guy that I would look for. If you're in deep leagues and you have the bench space, you can maybe stash him. I'm not really stashing him in like 5 or 6 or 7 bench spots. I probably wouldn't keep him on my bench. But if one of those guys gets hurt, I'm definitely going to play him. Another guy I keep in mind of is Deontay Johnson on the Steelers. He's another one that they haven't given us a ton of info on. We don't know if he's gonna be back. He's expected to play. That's kind of the last news on that. But it's almost Sunday, and we don't fully know what's gonna happen. I'm kind of 50-50 on this one. I think he can play. We've seen the last couple of years, like, this is what he does. He's hurt, and then he somehow plays. So there's still a couple days until they kind of have to give like a full injury report. I think it is Wednesday, so tomorrow, that they do have to like fully disclose that. So we'll see in the next couple of days if he's trending towards playing or trending towards not. If he somehow does not play, I would play Chase Claypool and George Pickens. I would start them. George Pickens is probably a guy that you're not going to start. If Deontay does play, you're kind of waiting to see how he does. But if Johnson doesn't play, I probably would play Claypool and Pickens. So, yeah, those are some storylines and injury news to kind of keep an eye on. These things change every day, and the better that you pay attention to these things, the more you're going to be on top of picking up a backup that can start and get you a lot of points. As well as like taking him from your opponent. Like if your opponent has Dobbins, they're probably looking for the backup running back. And so that's kind of your chance to take him so that your opponent isn't able to get those points. Next up, we're going to go over my streamers. I kind of picked several players that I think could be a good streaming option. So these are players that are generally outside of the top, definitely outside of my top 16 rankings, but sometimes they're way deeper than that. Sometimes they're outside of the top 30 at the position. And so these are players that, based off their matchup and based off their current situation, I think they can do well in week one's games. I'm not saying that they're going to do well every week for the rest of the year, but if you're in a pinch and you really need to start somebody, I think these guys can play well for this current game at the position. Now for week one, you're probably not gonna deal with this that much because you're gonna play the guys you drafted. But if you guys like are hurting at tight end, maybe you drafted a tight end really late, or maybe you have Zach Ertz and you're worried about who do I play next, then this is for you. I think this is gonna help. So first one, at the quarterback position, I have Matt Ryan versus Houston. I don't know how many people are rostering Matt Ryan or even going to play Matt Ryan for the first several weeks, but I think he can do well. He's playing Houston this week. It is away, and even though Houston has kind of like tried to bolster their defense, I don't think they have that good of a defense. I think Matt Ryan's going to have a good game. I don't necessarily trust Matt Ryan this year, but I think he'll be a good streaming option. I think you'll be able to play him in certain games, and I think he'll be able to deliver with 20 points. So I think that's a game versus Houston. The Colts, they always play well versus Houston. I don't know what it is. T.Y. Hilton always would have a game against Houston. He would be basically called T.Y. Houston, just of how well the Colts play against them. So I would look to Matt Ryan if you guys are like kind of not feeling your quarterback position, or maybe you just don't like the matchup. Maybe you play strictly by matchups. Then I would pivot to Matt Ryan. I think he's going to do well. Next up is the tight end position. So I talked about him, Trey McBride. If Zach Ertz doesn't play, I would look to play Trey McBride. If Zach Ertz does play, but he's limited, I would maybe stash McBride, but I may not start him. Another guy that you could start is Gerald Everett on the Chargers. I think Everett's going to do pretty well. I know that we're kind of waiting for a breakout season for Everett. Everyone keeps talking about it. last year on the Seahawks, he was kind of a pick that a lot of analysts were hoping that he was going to break out, but he ended up not. I still think he has a lot of upside. I'm not expecting him to have this crazy season, but I think he'll be streamable this year. I think he'll have some games, and I think you'll be able to start him, knowing that he'll be able to get you at least 10 points at the tight end position, which normally struggles. So I like him this game. They're playing Las Vegas at home, and I would stream him if you're struggling at tight end. Next up is wide receiver. I have AJ Green, another Cardinal. They're playing Kansas City at home. And if you look at what AJ Green did last year, he did pretty well. I think with the D-Hop suspension, if Ertz is out, you're basically looking at Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore, AJ Green, and McBride. Rondale Moore is struggling with an injury as well. I think he is back practicing, and I think he's going to play. But he often is that punt kick returner, and he's kind of that fast, shifty guy that you kind of can use in the backfield, and you can use him in the slot. And I know they like him, but he's not super consistent. He's not that guy you can lean on. Last year, AJ Green did really well. He was a guy you could lean on. We haven't heard anything about injuries. Seems like he's really healthy, and I think he could have a really good game against Kansas City. I'm not playing him over most of the guys that you draft. Like, if you drafted a guy for a reason, like, you're gonna play him until he shows you something else. But if you're really weak at wide receiver, if you drafted a lot of running backs, and maybe say you're sitting at like Hunter Renfrow, and I don't know who your second wide receiver is. Maybe you have like Hunter Renfrow and Tyler Lockett, which isn't terrible. But you could be looking at like, man, I don't like Tyler Lockett against the Broncos. I would understand that. I think you probably still would want to play Tyler Lockett because you don't know what's going to happen. But if you're liking AJ Green's matchup better, I think he could be a wide receiver you can start in a pinch. But he's definitely got to keep an eye on, because if he does well this game, he's probably going to get picked up off the waivers next week, and he's probably going to get stashed. So I would take a look at him, maybe see if you want to have him on your bench, because if he does well this game and he has a good second game, then he's going to be rostered and probably played. Because if you looked at last year, he didn't have a ton of consistent games, but he had several good games. And it was one of the best seasons from him that we've seen in a long time. So if he's able to reproduce that this year, he's going to get taken pretty early. He's probably on the bench right now, and if he does well the first couple games, that's not going to be the case anymore. So keep an eye on him. Next up, for running back, my streamer is Hines on the Colts. Similar to kind of what I was talking about with Matt Ryan, the Colts always play really well versus Houston. Hines is a guy that's frustrating to me. I drafted him last year, felt pretty good about him. He would have one or two crazy games where he would get 20, 30 points, and then he would have games where he got like 2 points, which sucks. It does. But he's a guy I think you can stream this week. They're going against Houston. Hines often does do pretty well against Houston, and they kind of allow those short dump off passes. And so I see Matt Ryan looking for Hines, kind of in the short passes to the running back. And I think Hines will do pretty well from a PPR perspective. If you're not in a PPR league, if you're in a standard league, I wouldn't play Hines. Just throwing that out there. But if you're in a half or full point PPR, I would consider playing Hines this week. Obviously, you're probably only going to play him if you're hurting at running back. You could play him in the flex, like if you have a 1 or 2 flex league and you don't have a guy you feel comfortable with. I think you could flex Hines this week. But yeah, you never know what you're going to get with him. And so those are my streamers. I think there's a couple other guys you can play at the position. But those are the guys that I would, if I'm in a pinch, if I don't feel good about my matchups week 1, I would consider playing those guys. Now, once we get into the middle of the season and late in the season, the streamers are going to be very valuable because you're going to have bye weeks, you're going to have injuries, and you're going to need to stream certain positions. Like if, say, after week 1, say most of your running backs or most of your wide receivers get hurt, you're going to have to be looking at these players that you can stream in a pinch. Because for those that have played fantasy for a long time, you know that it can definitely get messy once the season gets started. So next up, we're going to be talking about stashes. We're going to be talking about bench and basically handcuffs. So bench and handcuffs, players that you can stash who may not be a starter right now. They may not be a guy you can play right now, but you can stash them on your bench with the hope that they will do well in the future. And there are a couple really good targets that I see that I would recommend you guys picking up right now. First one is Zamir White. He's a running back for the Las Vegas Raiders. I like Zamir White a lot. I think one of the most encouraging signs about him is that they drafted him this year. He's a rookie. He's out of Georgia. He split the backfield with James Cook in Georgia, and he ended up doing really well on the ground, even though he split a lot of snaps and a lot of looks with Cook. Zamir still outperformed Cook on the ground. He still got the majority of those handoffs. And I think the most encouraging sign about him for the Raiders this year is that the Raiders had Kenyon Drake as the running back number 2, as the backup to Josh Jacobs, and they let him go. I believe they released him, and the Ravens picked him up, and so basically that means that Zamir White's going to be that second guy behind Jacobs. But a lot of people are predicting that eventually Zamir is going to take over that backfield. Yeah, McDaniels is not committed to Jacobs. Jacobs is on the final year of his contract. It has not been renewed yet. And I think the Raiders are okay with letting him go. That said, I don't think they're going to rely on Jacobs solely this year. I think they're going to use a multiple back approach for their running back room. I think they're going to attack with multiple players. I don't think they're going to lean on a workhorse running back. And so I'm not playing Zamir White yet, but I definitely would pick him up and keep him on your bench. One of my leagues, I'm in a 5-player bench league. And so you kind of have to like be picky with the guys that you roster on your bench, because there are some good stashes that you can have. But one of those stashes I'm currently using on is for Zamir. I'm not going to play him quite yet. I want to see him for a couple of weeks. But with how well he's played this preseason, I think he's a guy you should probably pick up before week 1 starts. Because if week 1 starts and Zamir starts doing really well and they give Zamir more work than we think, then he's going to be a top waiver wire target, and you're going to wish that you picked him up before the season started. Now, that being said, you could pick him up as a stash. In the first couple of weeks, he could do nothing. I think if that were to happen, then we would reevaluate if you should drop him for someone else. But week 1 hasn't started yet. I think this is a perfect time to pick him up, see what happens week 1, and go from there. So another guy like that that is pretty similar is Tyler Algier on the Falcons. Now, recently, people are kind of a lot lower on Algier than we were like even a week ago. There are reports that he's not as high up in the backfield as most people thought. A lot of people were predicting him as a rookie to be able to come in and take over and like eventually take the backfield from Patterson. But there's been reports that Damian Williams, who used to play on the Chiefs and then he was on the Bears, there are reports that he's actually doing pretty well and that he may be the number 2 running back behind Patterson in the Falcons running room. And so I would still look for Algier. I would still look to have him as a stash on your bench. I don't think he's a bad guy to roster. I'm in a league where someone dropped him, and I think it's mainly because of the fear that he's going to be number 3 in that running room. But I wouldn't let that make you hesitant quite yet. I would still pick him up and have him on my bench and see what happens the first couple of weeks if you have the bench space, obviously. I don't think you're going to want to start him anytime soon. I think it's probably going to take several weeks and maybe the middle of the season for him to actually get enough production for you to start him week in and week out. But I think if he shows his stuff the first couple of weeks, I think he can definitely pass Damian Williams. I'm not super worried about him. I think with the Falcons, because they have a young team and they have they're kind of like a ragtag group of individuals. I think there's no reason not to give Algier work. I don't think they're going to just shield him. I think they want to give him reps and experience. And eventually, I think the backfield is going to be his. So if you have the room for it, I would roster him. But just know that it's probably going to be a little longer than we thought in regards to him taking over the backfield. Another running back is Mike Davis. Talked about him a little bit ago. He's on the Ravens. If Dobbins misses week 1, I'd probably play Mike Davis if Dobbins missed week 1. But I definitely would roster him right now. He's a guy that, while the Ravens room is pretty murky, we've seen Mike Davis be a valuable handcuff 2 seasons ago. And he didn't do amazing last year on the Falcons, but he still, I think, is a really solid handcuff, and he's a guy that NFL teams knows can definitely produce when needed upon. And so keep an eye on Mike Davis. I would roster him over Kenyon Drake for that Ravens backfield, and I think a lot of people don't trust Mike Davis, so he may be on the waiver wire right now. And if you're in a league where you can instantly pick up players before the season starts, I would look to pick him up right now. But definitely keep an eye on the Dobbins storyline because we don't fully know what's going to happen with that. A couple wide receivers to stash. First one is KJ Osborne on the Vikings. A lot of people don't respect Osborne. I think he's going to have a good season. And I think once he starts having a couple good games, you're not going to be able to get him. You're not going to be able to get him for cheap. And so I would pick him up now if you have the roster space, and I would just hold on to him for a couple of weeks, see how he does. But if anything were to happen to Adam Thielen or Justin Jefferson, Osborne is going to definitely value from that. And so, I think he's going to do really well. He's the 3rd wide receiver in the Minnesota receiving room. And I mean, if you've watched some of my videos, I'm predicting the Vikings to do really well this year. I think Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson are going to have great years, but I think KJ Osborne can definitely value from that. And so I wouldn't mind holding him on my bench if you're hurting at wide receiver. Another wide receiver stash are the Baltimore Ravens receivers. Now behind Rashad Bateman, there's a lot of iffiness of okay, who's going to be that number 2 guy? Some people think it's James Prochet. Some people think it's Devin Duvernay. And so either of those guys, I would say you can have as a stash on your bench. I would probably prioritize James Prochet. I think he seems like he's going to be the number 2 guy. He has been dealing with an injury recently, but it sounds like he's practicing. And I would probably put him on my bench after week 1. I think there are some other stashes to prioritize, like the ones that I previously mentioned. But if he does well week 1 or even week 2, I think he's a guy that you probably want on your bench just to see what happens with that Baltimore receiving room. Because if Lamar Jackson starts throwing a lot better, if they start having a lot more receiving yards than normal, I think Prochet is probably going to be one of those guys to help him get there. So keep an eye on them. If you like that team, then I would maybe even roster them right now. Another guy, we talk about him every year. Most of the time it's negative, but it's Robbie Anderson. Robbie Anderson is still on the Panthers, and he is always that guy that you're feel like he's a really good player, and then he has really good games, and then he just lets you down. And no one's really talking about him right now, which is surprising because we're normally always talking about him because he's a roller coaster. But I think Robbie Anderson could be a stash right now. He's going to be playing with Baker Mayfield, who I do think is a lot better quarterback than Sam Darnold. Some people may disagree on that, but I do like Baker better in that scenario. And I think Robbie's a good player. I think Robbie, I think he does really well along next to DJ Moore. And I think Baker's going to look for him. I think Robbie, as long as he chooses to catch the ball, I think he's going to do really well. If you look at last season, he had a ton of targets. I believe he had over 100 targets. And now he didn't execute on those targets. But I think part of it was Sam Darnold, and I think part of it is just Robbie had a bad year. I think that he can pick that back up this year. I think he's a guy that you can stash on your team right now. And if he has a couple of good games, you may even start him. And so keep an eye on Robbie Anderson. He's probably not rostered in your leagues, and he's probably a guy that you can pick up right now. Tight ends to keep in mind of are tight ends that I have ranked pretty high, but they're probably not rostered in your leagues. Hayden Hurst, Austin Hooper, just talked about with Gerald Everett. Those are guys that are probably not rostered, and I think they can have really good seasons. Tight end position is sticky. You're probably not going to want to roster multiple tight ends, which I totally understand. I normally never do that. But if you're in really deep bench leagues, then maybe you do want to have a second tight end. That's totally up to you. But those are the guys I would look for the tight end position. Quarterback position, I tend to only roster one quarterback. I know a lot of people like having multiple, but with how deep the quarterback position is, if I have a bye week, then there's a guy I can just pick up and stream for that week. But for some stashes, I would look for Tua. I think that he can have a really good season. He's probably not drafted in your leagues, and if he is, you can probably get him pretty cheap if you do want to trade for him. Other guys that I would look to rosters is probably Matt Ryan, maybe Carson Wentz. I know that you're not super confident in those guys, but those are guys that I think could definitely you can stream in a pinch, and you can often stash to where if your quarterback does get hurt, then you can play those guys and at least feel okay at that position. So next up, we're going to talk about trades. I know it's super early, and most people aren't trading right now, which I think is probably a good thing. You're not going to like look at your team and be like, oh man, I just need to like blow up my team, even though like you just drafted your team. So that's on you. But what I do want to say about trades is that if you are hurting at position like running back position, I would look to see how you can improve that. And a way to do that is to look at the other players in your league, see where they're hurting. If you have guys that are hurting at wide receiver and you have a lot of wide receivers, offer them those players. Try to package a couple wide receivers into one okay running back. A guy that I would maybe look to target that you can probably get pretty cheap is Antonio Gibson. Obviously, you're not going to feel great about Gibson, but neither do the owners that probably are rostering Gibson. They're probably not feeling great about him. And I think that if you package a couple solid wide receivers, I think you can probably get Gibson, and I think he could be a value and a guy that probably would make you feel better about your running back situation on your team. Another thing for trades too is that I often am a guy that likes trading for value. If you have a player that you feel like is lesser than a different player and you're able to work out a deal for that guy, you're probably going to feel pretty good about yourself. But it's so early in this season, like the season hasn't even started yet, to where don't feel like you need to trade. I love trading. It's one of my favorite parts about fantasy football. But just know that you drafted your team for a reason. And if you did your homework, if you did your research, then you should have confidence in the team that you drafted. If there are guys that you don't feel confident about, if you're realizing, oh man, like I made a stupid mistake on drafting that guy, then sure, go try to fix it. But you drafted your team for a reason. Don't go blow up your whole team just because you want to get some trades in, which is something that I've done because it is fun. I love trading. It's a great time, but feel confident in your team knowing that, okay, I did my homework, I did the work ahead of time, and we're going to see what happens. Just at least wait the first week, because after the first week, it'll give you a better idea of how well you did draft. So yeah, that's my my week one kind of overview. I think there's a lot of other things that we can cover, but before the season starts, it's a little tricky just because it helps seeing data. Like once we're able to see how the players actually produce week one, then we'll have a lot better idea of like, okay, these are the players that we should prioritize. These are the players you should trade for, and these are the players that you should stash. But I would definitely keep an eye on for the stashes that I listed. I think Zamir White can do really well this year. I like him a lot, and so I would definitely look to roster him on your bench. But yeah, I'm super excited for the season to start. Let me know in the comments what you guys would like me to cover. If you do have any start or sit questions, shoot me a message. I would love to cover those. And in my future weekly overviews, I'm going to be going over more details on storylines as well as who should I start over this other guy. And so it helps me having those scenarios in hand because then I can definitely cover those directly in my videos. So I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and we will see you next week after week one. See ya.